to do first is go around and introduce ourselves so we all know who each other are, for sure. And also, basically just introduce what we're doing. So let's just go ahead first by going around and introducing.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm Steve Schock, and second time I've been here, and I just enjoy the conversation.
I'm Teresa O'Farrell, and this is the first time I've been here. I'm kind of curious what you're talking about, and I like good intellectual conversation.
Good.
So.
And where are you from?
I grew up here in Cincinnati.
So how far did you have to drive?
East Walnut Hills, so
Okay.
I'm not very far. I'm an accountant. So, I deal with columns of numbers. It's not very esoteric.
Good. Well, I'm Mark. All of you know me. Moderator of the group. Chris.
My name is Christopher, and I'm here to expand my knowledge and my experience and grow and evolve.
My name is John, and this is my first time here also, so forgive me if I breach any etiquettes that I don't know about. But I'm looking for a good forum to have conversations like this.
My name's Dave. I'm the Calvin and Hobbes picture on the website. You'll see a number of my comments or YouTube links.
Yeah.
Well, my first name is David. A lot of times I'll go by Cody, so either is fine. I've been here a few times before, kind of sporadically, but I've enjoyed every time I've been here. So.
My name's Eric, and I guess this is about my fourth time here, I think. And I came here initially because I was looking for intelligent discussion. I like science a lot, but I didn't see any science discussion groups. And philosophy is really interesting to me. There's a particular branch of philosophy I'm very interested in, and this group is helping me to expand my knowledge of philosophy.
Hi, I'm Brian Sumner, and I'm here because I'm just interested in the topic and looking forward to an evening of interesting conversation.
Good. Well, it's great to have everybody here. Let me just kind of lay some of those ground rules here. What I want to make sure that happens is that no one dominates the discussion. So if you feel like you need to restrain yourself, please do so. And what I like to do once in a while is do around the room things. And so what we want to do, if we do that, is be pretty brief in what we say there. What I want to do first is to introduce the topic through a PowerPoint, and then I'll have John give a presentation.
Can you make the new guy go first?
Well, I want to even it out because I'm going to be a little bit more pro-teleological argument, and so then you can go, and then Cody then can go. Did anyone else come prepared with a handout or anything like that?
Not with a handout. I just had some notes.
You have some things you can. Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll then bring back to you. I had someone else that was going to give a presentation, but he couldn't get here in time. So, but then we'll have obviously a free for all. No problem. We'll just jump in. I like to give about 5 or 10 minutes per presentation. Just kind of give you a chance to give a monologue, give you a chance to share your thoughts, and then we'll react to it. So that's kind of how we do things. So I've been to a lot of philosophy meetups, so I kind of know, I know how I feel when I'm like the only one with the perspective that I hold. It doesn't seem like I could ever really give a good chance to say my piece. And so what I believe is that everyone should be able to present their point of view. And I know we have a really good mix here of atheist, agnostic, Christian, all different kind of, and NTS, whatever we have here. We have lots of different worldviews here represented, so we're glad to have everybody here. Okay. Now, one more thing I want to say is, one thing that I really appreciate about this group is the congeniality. We don't get into fights, we don't argue, we don't get mad. We express very, very contrary views to one another, yet that we're nice about it. And so I appreciate all of you in that way. Any form of the theological argument reasons a posteriori, that is from experience, from the apparent order and design of the universe to an intelligent cause. Order and design is the product of mind. And I would like to think that everyone would accept that last sentence there, that order and design is the product of the mind. But we'll see what you say here. The teleological argument is an argument from probability. It's not an absolute proof. So it's helpful to have, even though in some sense it is a standalone argument, it has a lot of value, a lot of validity to it, yet it is a probabilistic argument. And therefore, if you use maybe some of others of Thomas's 5 ways, like the argument from contingency or first cause, I think that does bolster the argument for the existence of God. Okay, let's look at some historical support for this argument. Plato said 2 things lead people to belief in God. The argument from the existence of the soul, which we're not going to talk about tonight. And then the argument from the order of the motion of the stars and of all things under the dominion of the mind which order the universe. Therefore, there must be a best soul who is the maker and father of all. And then Aristotle, this is just one example of how he talks about the teleological argument, telos, that he sees in the universe. He says, if a race of men who always had lived underground were able to escape to see the sky, when thus they would suddenly gain sight of the earth, seas, and sky, when they should come to know the grandeur of the clouds and the might of the winds, when they should behold the sun and should learn its grandeur and beauty as well as its power to cause the day by shedding light over the sky, and again when the night had darkened the lands and they should behold the whole of the sky spangled and adorned with stars, and when they should see the changing lights of the moon as it waxes and wanes, and the risings and settings of all these celestial bodies, their courses fixed and changeless throughout all eternity, when they should behold all of these things, most certainly they would have judged both that there exist gods and that all these marvelous works are the handiwork of the gods. So he's making a case that through the teleology, there's evidently through the intricate workings of the world, there is evidence of purpose and order that must be the result of the gods. King David in the Psalms said, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day and the day utter speech, and night and the night reveals knowledge. There is no speech in a language where their voice is not heard. Their sound has gone out throughout all the earth, and the words to the end of the world. So the heavens declare the glory of God. The Apostle Paul in Romans, what may be known about God is plain because God has made it plain. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So we should know by looking at the world around us, according to Paul, that there is a God and that he is all-powerful. There is a great power. Now, all of you are familiar with the argument from William Paley, the analogy, the watchmaker analogy. God is to the world as a watchmaker is to a watch. A watch displays function, order, design. We infer that it must have a designer. Likewise, on a much grander scale, the entire world displays function, order, and design. Therefore, the world must have had a designer. Well, David Hume disputes that and says, for one thing, we only live in a tiny part of the universe. How do we know that the whole universe displays function, order, design? Or how do we know from one instance of a universe, the one we live in, that universes in general have certain features such as function, order, design? And then Charles Darwin comes along. He says, well, a designer isn't necessary, at least in biology, because evolution, through natural selection, can produce all the different plants and animals without a designer. So you don't need God, you don't need a designer, because we have another explanation. And then the intelligent design movement comes along and says, well, wait a minute, even if evolution occurred, intelligence still must be involved because of specified complexity of information in DNA, cells, etc. Intelligent design proponents claim that they are not advocating a God of the gaps theory, that if we can't explain something, the explanation must be God. Instead, they see positive evidence of design in the structures they are studying. So, intelligent design is a scientific theory that holds some aspects of life in the universe are best explained by reference to an intelligent cause. Why? Because they contain the type of complexity information that in our experience comes only from intelligence. The past 60 years of biology researchers have uncovered that life is fundamentally based upon a vast amount of complex and specified information encoded in a biochemical language, a computer-like system of commands and codes that processes the information, molecular machines, and multi-machine systems. But where in our experience do things like language, complex and specified information, programming code, or machines come from? They have one and only one known source: intelligence. So in all probability, the universe itself, with all of its complexity, also has intelligent, comes from intelligence of some kind. Whether it's God or not, the teleological argument doesn't prove, for instance, the Christian God, but it shows that there probably was some kind of designer. Okay, now this is something that I think we have another presentation on, but we just introduced the argument from the fine-tuning of the universe. The universe is fine-tuned for the existence of human life with such delicacy that it defies comprehension. For example, the weak force, which operates inside the nucleus of an atom, is so finely tuned that to alter its value to even 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power would prevent a life-permitting universe. To alter the cosmological constant, which drives the acceleration of the universe's expansion by only 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, would also prevent a life-permitting universe. To have an accuracy of even 1 part in 10 to the 60th power is like firing a bullet to the other side of the observable universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting a 1-inch target. That's how fine-tuned the universe is. So the question is, where does this come? How did this come to be? So here's the argument, and you'll see this articulated pretty well. You go to William Lane Craig's website, Reasonable Faith, and you'll see him talk about this. Premise 1: the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2: the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance. Conclusion: the fine-tuning is due to design. So probably premise 1 would be uncontroversial, unless you can think of a 4th option there. But it's number 2. So you might say, well, maybe this is due to chance or physical necessity. So let me give some support for premise 2. What about the physical necessity? Well, the most promising candidate for a theory of everything, beyond theory or superstring theory, only works if there are 11 dimensions But the theory can't explain why that number of dimensions should exist. Also, M-theory doesn't predict a light-permitting universe. There's no evidence that light-permitting universes are physically necessary. Light-permitting universes are not only possible, but also far more likely than light-permitting universes. And that's what this leads to the next point. Well, what about chance? Maybe it just happened by chance. Well, this is an unreasonable alternative because the chances that the universe that exists should just happen by chance to be light permitting is very remote. And this is my last point here. This is just an illustration. This is the last thing. A lottery illustration. Okay, so billions and billions of white ping pong balls mixed together with one black ping pong ball. Okay, so visualize this huge thing that holds all these balls. If the one that comes down the chute is black, you are allowed to live. That would be like the light permitting universe. If white, you die. Sure, some ball will be picked, but what are the odds that the black one will be picked? Okay, so it'd be very, very, very small, and if that's not good enough, what if the black one is picked 5 times in a row? I don't think anybody in this room would think that would not have happened by design. So that would be like the situation we're in with the fine-tuning of the universe. All right. Let me now shift over to our first response.
I will be opposing the teleological argument. I approach it from the theist's perspective. I realize that the argument is technically deist, or proposing a deist position, but its contemporary proponents are often theists, so I'm going to be approaching it from there. Today I hope to show the following: how a deductive form of the teleological argument fails because it is both invalid and unsound, that the inductive form of the argument fails due to a lack of precedence and is damaging to the theist's general position. And finally, his commentary that Christian apologetics, such as this, are simply a distraction to an honest discussion about belief. Now, the deductive form of this argument focuses on the notion that complexity predicates design, and could take the following premises and conclusions, or something very similar to these. The first premise being that all complex things are things that are designed. Premise 2, there exist complex things in our world which we, known intelligences, did not design. Therefore, some unknown intelligent designer exists, and we call it designer God. Now, never mind for the moment how the teleologist arrives at premise 1. Just recognize that it's ultimately indispensable to the deductive part of the argument that we're currently addressing. One of the hallmark rules of formal reasoning is that the conclusion cannot be assumed in the premises. And here we see no mention of God in either. But look closer. Premises 1 and 2 are inherently contradictory if we do not make allowance for the divine beforehand. Now let us forgive the vague definition of complexity. Instead, let us focus on the shifty usage of the word design. In premise 2, design ostensibly acknowledges by known intelligences, lest it be so bold as to beg the question outright. But it subtly requires in premise 1 that an unknown designer must exist to allow for all non-man-made complexities we observe. If it didn't, then only known designed things, like watches, could qualify as complex. And that doesn't really get us anywhere. I see no other wording that would avoid this fallacy, thus the question is begged and the argument invalid. The argument is also unsound. Like much of apologetics, it is an attempt to force truth on our world through pure logic alone by aiming for unfalsifiability. Through definitions like the vague word complex and the hidden moving goalposts of the word designed, it hopes to hide the fact that it is not explaining any mysteries of this world, but is instead preserving them by rolling them up into a supernatural realm where mystery is embraced and untouchable. Despite religion's best efforts, the human endeavor to objectively explain the world around us, science, has shown how complexity can come about without the need for an intelligent driving force. This calls into serious question the soundness of premise 1. So what makes this argument so persuasive to well-known apologists like William Lane Craig and Dinesh D'Souza? At this point, I hope it's clear that the heart of the deductive fallacy lies in premise 1, and it is faulty inductive reasoning that allows theists to arrive at this premise unperturbed. They conclude the presence of complexity in both man-made things and in nature is inductively indicative of both showing a feature of design. The problem is that there isn't any actual precedence for design in naturally complex things. A watch has precedence of design. I can tune to the Discovery Channel and watch how it's made, as indeed I often do. But at the ready agreement of the theists, no mortal man has ever designed a dog or a cat. Now, we can hypothesize about the analogous nature of the complexity of natural and man-made things, but as with any application of hypothesis to reality, we must adhere to the law of parsimony, accept the conclusion that explains the most facts while requiring the fewest new assumptions. And the new assumption in this case is a real doozy. If we are to open the doors of induction, the theist will find he has stepped through and onto a slippery slope indeed. What precedents do we have of omnipotence or of omniscience? How about telepathy and the ability to exist outside of time and space? Any precedents for these? No, God is by definition without any precedents, and that makes him, by means of simple inductive reasoning, the most improbable conclusion imaginable. And since we can't establish the conclusion before the premises, he is also the most cumbersome of new assumptions. Poor Occam just cut himself with his own razor. He was a theist after all. Let's imagine for a moment that I've successfully discredited the teleological argument. And indeed I think I have, as have countless philosophers before me. So why are we still talking about it? Well, the theist, biased by his necessitated belief, based not on reason, but on deeper subconscious influences, is not invested in the outcome of the argument. He has no stake in whether his logic fails or thrives. Tear down the facade, and the structure remains to be built time and time again. But to the intellectually honest, his position stands firmly on the validity of his logic, and he will dutifully rise to any challenges. The intoxicating allure of an engaging debate is inevitably an illusion, ending in a cheap climax and quick dismissal as the theist cries faith and leaves completely unaffected. This is why I believe arguing apologetics is a red herring, a distraction, and not at the heart of humanity's pervasive yet delusional belief in God. If the atheist believes his position best, and the dissemination of his ideas noble, I advise him to look away when the carrot of apologetics is dangled in front of him, and search instead for the social identity, the structure, and ultimately the fear, not logic, that drives theism.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Your inductive form has an attribution. Where did you get your deductive form?
A deductive form. I did not pull this from any source.
Okay.
These are just my understanding of the argument and how I drive at it.
So it's possible that the deductive form. I mean,
It's possible that my wording could be replaced by other wording, but I was not able to think of any. So I'd be very happy to see other forms that could be.
Yeah, because I was going to say. I mean, I do see a problem with that form, but I don't necessarily think that undermines the teleological argument because their form doesn't hold. I guess.
No, I mean, as with any argument, there's 1,000 ways to phrase it.
Well, yeah, but I guess I'm not sure if this phraseology necessarily. I think
the whole teleological.
Yeah,
argument.
I mean, I think it grabs certain, I would say, bad presentations of it, which are probably quite common. But I've heard better, I guess, versions of that. So I guess I was curious if that came from anything specific.
Be interested to see other versions that are better.
Okay. Would you like me to read them quickly, or do you want to try to move on?
Well, no, I've got my email address in there if we want to.
Sure, that's fine.
Have a longer discussion.
Excellent. Okay.
I have one question on the deductive form. In part 2, is the word, should it be known or what is the word? We known intelligences? We know intelligences?
No, like we are the known intelligences. I didn't want
But
to say
we-
man-made because technically, like a gorilla could make something, and that's going to have some form of complexity or order, depending on the definition of the word. So, known intelligences being the things that aren't being tried. We're not trying to prove them with the conclusion of the argument. The intelligences that are not God.
Okay, you lost me. I'm not that smart.
Sure you are.
Okay, it says there exist complex things in the world. I'm with you, which are not designed.
Yeah, say we take out known intelligences and say which we did not design.
Which we did not design.
But the reason I
But
didn't
they
want to say
did, somebody
just
else
we,
did design it. Is that what you're saying?
There are complex things. So, for example, like a dog. We think that a dog is complex, but we, known intelligences, did not design a dog.
Right.
So it exists, it's complex,
Right.
but as our current understanding states, we did not design it.
Oh, okay. You're not implying that there is a designer.
No, I'm implying that there's complexity,
Right. Yeah, gotcha.
but
Okay.
that as of yet, before the conclusion's been reached,
Gotcha.
we don't know that it could be designed or not.
I think there's probably other arguments as well that are going, I mean, there's, when you, with regard to your presentation, there were an awful lot of things in there that weren't touched on in
Right.
his argument. So
That's right, yeah.
I think there's a great deal that could be discussed in your argument that could be argued against or argued for that aren't even touched here.
It would be a lot more helpful to me if I were to have your actual paper in front of me
Okay.
so I could react to some things if I had anything
Yeah.
to react to. But, because this here is just, what you're doing is just giving kind of the general argument there.
Well, you said a one-page handout.
Yeah.
My script
yeah.
was a
No,
little
that's
longer than one
fine. No, I
page.
didn't, yeah, no, that's fine, I'm sorry.
I have a question. With the deductive form, I'm an accountant, but I'm not in science.
I'm a project
So-
manager. I have
Yeah,
no
so,
training,
you know,
it's cool.
I took science in high school, but that was a really long time ago. So, deductive form, meaning you've got a premise, then you've got points that prove it, and then you come to a conclusion. Scientific method, right? You have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and then you come to a conclusion, correct? I mean, that's
Deductive
basically,
usually being you start with like a generalized statement and then a specific statement, and then you generally draw some kind of a specific conclusion.
so what you were saying basically is that if what's in your hypothesis is already drawing from your conclusion, then you've
Right.
messed up the whole format here.
Right.
That then it doesn't that you're not
Right.
you're not proving anything if you're putting your conclusion in your. I mean, you're already assuming your conclusion up front,
Right.
right? So, so what you're saying here is that by saying that all complex things are designed, what you're saying is that in that statement, that's already assuming that there's a designer.
It's
and before
hidden.
you're even beginning.
Yeah,
that
it's
if
hidden.
it's designed, then somebody had to design it, that it didn't happen by
Right.
chance.
Let
So,
me address a couple things here. First of all, it's more accurate to talk of a deductive argument as that which has a certain form, which means that if premise A, if all the premises leading up to the conclusion are true, then because of the inference that follows from these premises, the conclusion has to be true. It's like
okay.
it's guaranteed to be true.
The,
If it's a valid argument.
the conclusion's a necessary condition for the premises, and the premises are a sufficient condition for the conclusion.
Yeah.
But the assumption is that the premises have already been proven.
Yes,
Okay.
right, and so sometimes you have to use either deductive logic or inductive logic to prove these premises. But if those premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true if the argument is valid.
Okay.
Well, the classic deductive syllogism is always the Socrates. All men are mortal.
Yeah.
Socrates is a man, thus Socrates is mortal. And so, because the two premises, if the two premises are true, and the argument is sound, which means those premises work together, then they will prove the conclusion.
Okay.
Well,
But then, but if one of the premises is not
Right.
true,
it can be
Then
valid,
the
but
whole
not
thing-
sound.
The whole thing,
Fall
the
apart.
conclusion may or may not be true, but it's not because of that argument.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just say one thing though about that first premise. I don't necessarily agree with that first premise.
I figured that would be the primary sticking point.
Yeah, because not all complex things are designed.
Like what?
Snowflakes, you know, I mean, in some sense, I suppose they were, in multiple sense maybe, but there's a pattern you can see, like what
So where does one draw
what
the
waves
line?
do to the sand on the ocean, on the shore. You know, there's various things that, but when you talk about specified complexity where information is necessary, the greater, the more information that's necessary for that design to be in place, the more complex, the more specified it is, the more likely it is that it is designed. And if it is designed, then that infers something, you know, probably infers a design.
Are you saying that there are patterns that don't necessarily contain information?
Yes.
If it contains information, then it's probably designed.
I mean, if it's just basic, and you know, you have 2 letters you're playing with, and the random, you could come up with maybe 3-letter words at random. I mean, that's not, you know, alphabet soup. You know, you can see configurations there that actually spell something. You know, but that's totally random. That's not by design. But the more complex that is, the more specified that is, the more likely it is that it's actually designed. And I think that's just a common sense.
But I think, you know, I mean, all things are designed, or I shouldn't say that, contain information, and which can't be destroyed, whether they're complex or not. And because you made a physics reference here, and Stephen Hawking lost this argument, saying that information is lost in black holes, and they've proven that that doesn't happen because information cannot be destroyed. So, I mean, you can get complexity out of very simple calculations, and get you know, things that are far more complex than you could ever imagine. So, you know, I don't think one goes with the other. You know, there isn't a, there doesn't need to be an outside force to make something complex.
Right, but it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, we're talking about language, very complex coding. I mean, it's just, I know we're talking about probabilities, we're talking about degrees here. It's not so, I mean, in a way, there's a qualitative difference here, but it's mostly a matter of degrees, where the farther up you go with specified complexity and the you know, how the language is so rich.
But again, I would say the weather is extremely complex, but it doesn't need, you know, someone to do that. And so you have a complex system that is probably the most complex system.
You say it's complex. I don't say it's complex. I'm
You
talking.
watch
You write a book, you know, that's complex. That's specified complexity. There's no way that this could have happened just by, you know, throwing ink into a printing press or something. There's no way you could come up with this. I mean, the most probable thing you can infer is that this is a result of that it was designed.
Excuse me, I'd like to just say regarding the weather as an example. It seems to me that it's an extremely complex thing. If you had all the variables that are available, that some of them we don't even know about, which go into the mix of controlling weather, predicting weather, understanding weather, you would understand that it's a very complicated thing. It's very complex. It's a complex natural system. Just because it's not encoded in a way that we understand it, doesn't mean it's not complex.
Okay, well then it must be designed. I mean,
Well, that's you're-
ultimately, I mean, I don't see how the forces, I don't see how all the weather systems and all that could be just here by chance.
I
don't-
think that
Yeah.
the ping pong ball argument, yeah, it's unlikely, but that doesn't mean it's impossible.
Right.
Unlikely doesn't mean impossible, and unlikely means possible.
Okay, so,
But it doesn't prove the existence of.
so,
But because
Well-
something's unlikely doesn't mean necessarily that it didn't happen.
that's right.
I-
That's why I say it's a probabilistic argument. But if you had 5 black ping pong balls come down the chute,
Yeah,
Right,
we'd all
one
go,
after
wow,
another.
that's pretty amazing.
that's pretty, yeah, but you
And we'd all-
would strongly suspect it was by design, wouldn't you?
I think everyone would suspect it was rigged.
Rigged, yeah, that's right. It was rigged.
Improbable things happen
That's
all the
the
time.
point. That's the point. But
But people still play the lottery when the chances of winning are next to
somebody has to
nothing.
win.
And somebody wins.
Sure,
No,
somebody
actually,
does.
somebody does.
But it's improbable that I will win.
Yeah.
I mean, if I buy a lottery ticket, it is highly improbable
But we
that I will
we
win.
know, we know that one of those balls will come down the chute. Somebody will win. Some ball will come down the chute. That's like you winning the lottery. Somebody's going to win. But what's the likelihood that that black ball will come down the chute? And that black ball would come down 5 times in a row? I mean,
But,
it's got to be rigged in that case.
well, it doesn't have to be.
Well,
It's unlikely.
it's very, 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 very unlikely.
But it doesn't prove that it's rigged.
No, we're not making an absolute.
And that's the whole argument of just because something is unlikely doesn't mean that it has to be designed. That just because something is complex doesn't mean that it didn't get that way all by itself. By chance or by nature or
Yeah.
by evolution or by just scientific chemical reactions. That
Sure.
just because it's complex or it's unlikely.
Sure. But I tell you what, I wouldn't bet my life that it's completely random if 5 black balls came out right behind the other. I mean, I would think there's no way I would bet my life on that.
I do have one question, and that is, probably to me the biggest single problem with this idea, this argument, is the question, from whence comes the designer? If you have a designer capable of building a complex universe, that designer would have to have been designed by something even more complex than him or her or it.
How does that
So-
follow?
Well, it has to do with Occam's razor. It has to do with how you go into an infinite regress. You go into it. If you have a designer, well, where did the designer come from? And you just keep going back, and you cannot ever, you can't ever finish the circle.
I was actually going to say, I think the infinite regress makes a little bit more sense on materialism because there's this idea that everything has to have, well, on materialism, the only thing that exists is the universe. And the question is the universe a necessary thing or is it a contingent thing?
Right.
And if it's contingent, then, well, ultimately it has to go back to something. The buck has to stop somewhere, or else you do have an infinite regress. And so I also don't necessarily see that the God who creates the universe has to be complex. As a non-physical being that's essentially a mind, there's a sense, I think, in which God would be very simple. Although I guess his thoughts could be complex. But I guess it seems to me that even if that argument were true, it's sort of like saying, archaeologists find arrowheads and they say, well, this suggests that some tribe must have fashioned these, and you don't go, well, how do you explain the tribe? I mean, the question is, does the hypothesis solve the problem, or potentially solve the problem, or probably solve the problem, or does it not? And so I think even if the argument did go through, it doesn't necessarily take away the explanatory power of the hypothesis. But I understand what you mean, that we now would have to sort of figure out a way to account for that hypothesis. But I would say that because I think would all agree that the universe is a contingent thing and not a necessary thing, it doesn't have to exist. And so the question would be, well, what does have to exist for the universe to come into existence?
Brian, I actually agree with your argument that you want to have the simplest explanation, and you can't have an infinite regress of designers. The buck has to stop somewhere, right? So then I would say the simplest explanation would be that whoever designed, whoever this designer was that made the universe, would be that which was independent, self-existent. The buck would stop with him, not with gods who created gods and created gods all before him.
But what about the idea of, something like the Big Bang? What about the idea of evolution? These scientific explanations, overlay them onto what we have, and it seems to explain everything very well, without the need for any being.
Oh, no.
I think so.
Well,
no. No, anyway, go ahead.
Okay.
No, they'll say something. I think Aaron had something to say.
Aaron?
Well, so my comment was back a few comments when we were talking about the lottery example. How strange would it be to have 5 black balls come up in a row? Like, what thought would that put into our mind? And in all honesty, if that occurred and I was there to watch it, I wouldn't necessarily think it's strange at all if our sample size is only 5, because if we have billions and billions of balls, then we need billions and billions of trials in order to really establish the statistics. If you just do 5 trials out of 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds, then you could get these strange patterns like this, but they would be meaningless because it's such a small sample size. And that's why whenever we play the lottery, odds are someone wins. Like, not always, of course, as you pointed out, but a lot of times people win the lottery, and that's because there's just a lot of people playing the lottery. So even something seems like it's very unlikely to occur.
Somebody wins the lottery because someone is determined to win the lottery. They eventually pick somebody to win. We just don't know who.
But sometimes nobody wins.
Right. But the reason they set up the lottery system was so that they would pick somebody to win eventually.
Right, but it's a random process that picks that winner. It's all coming out of machines.
But if they pick the same person to win 5 times in a row, you would know it was rigged.
I've heard of people winning the lottery at least 3 times in a row. Or not in a row, but to even win the lottery more than once in a lifetime is extremely improbable. But I've always said extremely improbable things happen all the time. It's actually very probable that something improbable will happen. For those people that the improbable happens to, I guarantee you they see some significance that isn't there. I think that's the heart of the anthropic principle, is that it's great if you are the one person who experiences the improbable and you go, oh, look at this is improbable, it must be evidence of something significant. But yet, it isn't. You just got really lucky. In the case of the lottery, I'm not entirely convinced that it's a perfect analogy to reality. We could sit and argue about lottery balls all day long, but I don't see that it's been shown to actually apply to physics. I have friends who know a bit more about physics than I do, that's for sure, who said that the universe is not fine-tunedly designed and it's not entirely random. And I would have to know what they're talking about to offer any real rebuttals to the concept of probability and randomness here in this part of the argument. But I just put it out there anyways.
I don't think there's a whole lot in the universe that is totally random. Things, there's laws of science that make things attract or repel, and there's all kinds of things that go on so the things that go on in the universe, how much of it is random? Very little. So yeah, the ping pong ball analogy, if that mechanism were truly random, would not be a good analogy for what's going on in the universe necessarily. It wouldn't. who says that you know, life came to be in this world, you know, randomly, but was it designed? I mean, isn't that our question? You know, who says that it happened randomly?
Yeah,
Maybe it happened because of
illustration.
scientific, because of, you know, the laws of nature.
Yeah.
And
Where did they come from?
Well, perhaps they evolved just like everything else. I mean, perhaps it started out very simple, but became complex over time. And we're talking billions and billions of years, right? Of the
Right.
universe. I mean, the other day I was listening to NPR on the way to work, and there was this thing where they're saying that the universe, they've now decided that the universe is much older than they originally thought, and is expanding at a much faster rate than they originally thought. And I thought, well, if it's older than they thought, then that kind of implies that there was a beginning, right? That if you've got an age of something, that it had to start somewhere. So that start, well, so was that the Big Bang? Well, but prior to the Big Bang, you know, so the Big Bang had to start somewhere, right? You know, but what if what was before the Big Bang just was, you know, in the YouTube, they talk about nothing. Well, but nothing meaning a space or lack of something there. Well, what if that just means the beginning of existence? Of all existence. Any kind of existence. Intelligent, non-intelligent, particular, you know, particle, any kind of, what if that was the beginning of existence? Now that's a very difficult concept to come up with, or to get your mind wrapped around. But it doesn't say that there was a God, necessarily, or, because that implies that there was something before something.
Okay, so this takes
So-
this takes us back into our last discussion of logical argument, which is fine. So would you agree with this, that for something to now exist, something must have always existed?
Not necessarily.
So you
I mean,
think-
that's my point.
So
that
you think something could come from absolutely nothing? Just pop, just spontaneously.
Yep.
I guess it possibly could.
David does, okay.
What, you know, I
I
sent you
mean,
that video,
why couldn't it?
you know,
Yeah, I watched that.
Why not?
I mean, that they prove it does. There is no such thing as nothingness, even in space. Particles pop
So,
in and out
so
of
it's
existence.
not literally nothing.
No, there is no, yeah.
They don't come in and out of existence. They fall out. They come out of the quantum vacuum.
Yeah.
The scientists mean something different by, or physicists mean something different by nothing than the philosopher
Exactly,
does.
yes.
But what it seems is that, quote, prior to the Big Bang, there's not a quantum nothing, not a physical a physics kind of nothing, but a philosophical nothing that
Yes.
it just comes into existence, right? Which is different than particles, you know, emerging in the quantum vacuum, right? Because they aren't literally coming out of nothing.
I guess it's, who's deficient? You know, whose description of nothing? I mean, you have, you know, the physicist's description of nothing and what everybody else calls nothing. People would think a vacuum is nothing, but that's not true.
Because there's space. There's still a space there.
There's still
a
things,
vacuum.
you know, they can test that things are happening in there. Even if you've got everything pumped out, a vacuum is not empty,
Right.
you know.
Well, yeah, and I think the issue is, you know, if we want to say maybe something kind of like a multi-universe, where our universe pops out of something else,
Right.
we do end up with that infinite regress. You know, because the thing is, the Big Bang seems to suggest a starting point, and we can postulate that it came out of something else, but how far back can we take that before we're dealing with absurdity? And so I think if we talk about the universe coming into existence, I think it's true that we can't just say that something physical caused it, because then that physical thing needs a physical explanation, because that's the way that physical things work. But if we're talking about a God that doesn't have a physical body, then I think that does offer an explanation. Whereas the physical thing would just raise a question of, well, where, you know, what set that physical thing in motion, and so on and so forth.
But we've had things throughout history that we can't wrap our minds around, you know, or we couldn't at the time, that we've later explained. So couldn't we be at a place in our development that we can't consider the possibility of something coming from nothing?
Okay, let me give you this interesting question. Let me review the cosmological argument from last time. This is just the simplest form of it. Whatever begins to exist as a cause, I think we argued about this a little bit. Whatever begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist. I think Aaron, you kind of settled that issue as a physicist. He says absolutely the universe did begin to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. So then, but this is an example of deductive logic where if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then premise 3 or the conclusion is true. It has to be true.
So was the argument then was about number 1?
That would be primarily where the argument was, yeah. Whatever if something begins to exist, does it have to have a cause? And what I argued was something cannot come from nothing. Vacuum is not nothing. If something can come into being from nothing, then why doesn't anything and everything come from nothing? We've never experienced that. We've never seen that. So, and then scientifically, premise 1 is constantly verified, never falsified. Common experience also confirms the truth of premise 1, like I just said. And then, and the premise 2, I think we all pretty much accepted. So if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then although we did argue some of that, the universe has a cause.
I would like to argue one of those right now, if I may.
Okay.
It's scientifically verified that things don't come from nothing. I strongly disagree with that because nowhere in our universe do we have nothing. Because as these gentlemen pointed out, if you say you have a box and you get rid of everything within it, you're still going to have space-time, the laws of physics. Those are still something. That's not nothing. I argued then, and I still argue now, that we have no idea what the properties of true nothing are because we've never experienced
So
it.
you're actually proving this point. So common experience confirmed this premise that, yeah.
But common experience is the question.
You said we've never experienced it. We've never experienced nothing, which means you haven't experienced.
I think he's saying that we can be as agnostic, right, on the issue?
Yes, I don't know whether or not something can come from nothing.
We've never
I
experienced
freely
that.
admit that my ignorance there.
Yeah.
But our common experience, who says that our common experience is the only experience? That what about all the experience in the universe that we've never, all the things in the universe that we've never experienced? What about all the things we don't even know exist? We don't know to ask about because we've never.
Well, sure, and we don't know that there's not a multiverse, but we've never seen it, we've never experienced it, we've never detected it. But you can theorize it. You can theorize anything you want.
Kind of like God.
We've
We've never experienced it. We've never seen it. We've never. I mean, it's
Well, a lot
it's
of
just
people,
conjecture,
would just
isn't
beat
it?
that.
Yeah.
Even Chris
Yeah.
here would just
Yeah, you have to speak for yourself on that one.
Yeah.
And then,
Experiencing God is possible.
but if something can come into being from nothing, then why doesn't anything and everything come? Well, because just because something possible doesn't mean it happens all the time. I mean,
Well,
it's kind of like an all or nothing kind of, that if it's possible, then it has to happen constantly, and that's not necessarily true.
Well, that's true, but in this case, it's like what would be the catalyst for something to come out of nothing?
Well, we don't know.
If it did, if there was such a thing as something coming from nothing, why wouldn't it happen all the time?
But
I
we
don't
don't
see
know why it did, or
Would there
we
be
wouldn't know why. So how
seem
can
like
we
there-
make it a rule?
It seemed like there had to be something about the nothing that would produce the something.
Logic.
So,
Yeah.
who's to say that everything doesn't always come from nothing, and that once the universe came from nothing, there was no more nothing from which everything could come.
Okay.
I do have a quick thought. I get the position of agnosticism, and I understand it, but when you talk about we don't know what properties nothing would have. I mean, if we're talking about a true nothing, couldn't nothing not have any properties, or wouldn't nothing
Sure.
not have any properties? I mean, so I wonder if that's the case. I mean, if something lacks any properties whatsoever, then it doesn't have the property to produce life, or even not to produce life. It just simply doesn't have any properties.
Sure.
Why are we even talking about nothing as a noun? Right? Nothing is a lack of nouns.
Yeah.
Just because we have a word to describe nothing doesn't mean that our word creates a concept and that we can then discuss the concept of nothing. There is no concept of nothing. It's a lack of something, if we can even say that. So I don't know, just anytime someone starts talking about the properties of nothing and whether or not things can happen with nothings, it's non-cognitivist to me. You can't even talk about those things because you're accomplishing nothing with rhetoric.
And you've used nothing several times there.
Yes, you can't not say it.
Okay, let's move to Cody's presentation.
I'll skip the first paragraph because Dr. Berg pretty much said something very similar. But I will discuss what some of the more specific fine-tuning arguments postulate. So this is not an issue about the laws of the universe, because some people will say, well, the laws were different. I think they understand the teleological argument to be saying, well, our laws are finely tuned so life can exist. And then you can always go, well, if the laws, you never know what kind of laws could exist. I mean, we could have completely different laws and still produce life. That's not really what the fine-tuning argument is postulating. It's sort of saying, in a universe that has our laws, there are certain constants and forces that seem to be finely tuned, where if they were off, life, it's hard, life is impossible to come into existence. So one example would be, skip down to the next paragraph, if the strong force were increased by as much as 1%, nuclear resonance levels would be so altered that almost all carbon would be burned into oxygen. An increase of 2% would preclude formation of protons out of quarks, preventing the existence of atoms. Just going down a little bit further, if gravitation had been a little greater, all stars would have been red dwarfs, which are too cold to support life-bearing planets. If it had been a little smaller, the universe would have been composed exclusively of blue giants, which burn too briefly for life to develop. So if we scroll to the last paragraph here, if we grant that these constants are fine-tuned, which is fairly uncontroversial in physics from what I understand, not a physicist, and that these are fine-tuned at incomprehensible odds, does this actually prove anything? A key consideration in the discussion of teleological arguments for God's existence is the anthropic principle. This principle posits fairly uncontroversially that if beings are able to observe the universe, then the universe must be compatible with conscious beings capable of observing it. It seems kind of like a tautology. The controversy surrounds how exactly one formulates this principle. A strong formulation, the strong anthropic principle, or SAP, claims that this is the case because the universe is somehow compelled for conscious life to emerge. This form is consistent with, and not necessarily equal to, a claim that a creator is behind the universe. It doesn't require this interpretation, however, because one could formulate the strong anthropic principle to simply be saying that conscious human life is inevitable, though unintended. This would require one to believe that the emergence of human life is necessary, simply a brute fact. However, there's no reason to believe that this is the case. In contrast, a weak anthropic principle tends to imply chance. According to the logic of this formulation, just because we seem to fit perfectly in this universe, that doesn't mean we are intended to. After all, if we didn't fit, we couldn't notice it because we wouldn't be here. Humorist novelist Douglas Adams supported the weak anthropic principle by using the illustration of a sentient puddle who, noting that it fit perfectly into a hole in the ground, supposed that the hole had been made expressly for it, as opposed to being made for the hole. Similarly, atheist Dan Barker quotes comedian Julia Sweeney in her example of the hand fitting perfectly into a glove, and then the reasoner reasoning falsely that the hand was made to fit into the glove instead of the glove to fit into the hand, or around the hand, rather. In other words, weak anthropic principle asserts that the appearance of design is illusory. However, other philosophers have claimed that the case of the universe is fine-tuning, or in the case of that, we're dealing with something qualitatively different. John Leslie gives the illustration of your being dragged before a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen to be executed. The command is given, ready, aim, fire, you hear the deafening roar of the guns, and then you observe that you're still alive, but all 100 trained marksmen missed. Now what do you conclude? I really shouldn't be surprised at the improbability of their all missing, because if they hadn't missed, then I wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. Since I am here, there's nothing to be explained. Of course not. While it's correct that you shouldn't be surprised that you don't observe that, you are dead, since if you are dead, you could not observe the fact. Nevertheless, it doesn't follow that you shouldn't be surprised that you do observe that you are alive. In view of the enormous improbability of the marksman's all missing, you ought to be very surprised that you observe that you are alive, and so suspect that more than chance alone is involved. Biologist and atheist thinker Richard Dawkins has stated on numerous occasions that the teleological argument has, for him, more weight than any other theistic argument. While he feels that evolutionary theory removes much of its force in the biological realm, he still finds it difficult to account for fine-tuning in the realm of physics. And he explains that at least in one place in those pages of the first edition of the God Delusion. In other words, the strong enthalpic principle that we are here because we are intended to be has some apparent explanatory power according to Dawkins. However, he rests this troubling difficulty on a, dare we call it, faith belief that science will one day find a naturalistic explanation of physics that is as impressive as Darwinism is for biology. Many atheists following this line of thinking have argued that theistic arguments are based on filling in gaps of current knowledge with superstition that will eventually be filled in by natural explanations. If we are to be patient, we will see solutions compatible with the philosophical presupposition of atheistic materialism. Of course, even if natural mechanisms were found that helped to fine-tune universal conditions, this would still not undermine the force of the teleological argument or the strong anthropic principle. God can certainly intend the universe to produce conscious beings while still using natural mechanisms to achieve this goal. Perhaps he has done just this. In any case, the force of the teleological argument is felt by nearly all of us. We see what looks to be the mark of intentionality throughout the universe. Evidence of fine-tuning may not be totally conclusive on an evidential framework, what evidence is after all. But like all evidential arguments, it raises the likelihood of its conclusion considerably. When we examine the odds of fundamental constants such as gravitation, the weak force, the strong force, etc., having the precise values that they do, and this precision being necessary for a life-permitting universe, it is difficult to say that this argument has no force, or that it doesn't provide good evidence for a creator, outside of course, a presupposition that you simply are opposed to supernatural explanations.
Okay, good. What are the strongest, before you poke the holes into it, what do you think the strongest points are of this argument? What did you think of the illustration of the firing squad of 100 trained marksmen?
I think it's an accurate description if you were to say, oh, I'm alive, what are the chances? But I would say that we don't really see that going on very much. In all of nature, if you are in a firing squad, you're going to be dead. It's observable, it's predictable. We don't really see the contrary. That wasn't really a point supporting it.
Yeah, that's fine. No, that's fine. Does anyone see the analogy and understand what the analogy is?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy is fairly clear, isn't it?
Okay.
I like the analogy, but what it raises is that what it's attacking the anthropic principle, and I don't even know if it does this, is the saying that, okay, this happened, and okay, you're alive to see it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't ask, why did it happen? I guess is how it's attacking it, is saying, just because it happened and you're there to experience it doesn't mean we don't have to ask, why did it happen? And that's very valid. It's always valid to ask why. But in the same sense as reality with physics and the universe, we can't then go from that conclusion and say a God stopped all of the guns from firing. There could very well be an explanation such as the person who is putting the buckets of bullets in front of them that day accidentally put in a bucket of blanks. And we may never, kind of like what you were saying, we may never actually have the information available to know what that bucket contained, but that's still also possible. It's just looking at the incident isn't enough to make the conclusion that a God did it, but it is enough to say this is interesting.
Well, I think that what I was kind of getting at was that because it's a probabilistic argument, I wouldn't want to say that this totally seals, puts the last nail in the coffin on atheism or something like that. But I think that most arguments we deal with, including scientific ones, are probabilistic to some extent.
I would say everything is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I agree. And so I think what I was kind of trying to get at is, it seems that what we're dealing with when we look at teleology, or apparent teleology, is a strengthening of the design hypothesis, even though it doesn't necessarily prove it. So that, at the very least, someone who is, open-minded could go, okay, well, this seems to be, adding some weight to the theistic side, or somebody who is a theist can say, well, I feel a little bit more comfortable with this position, or someone who's antagonistic to the theistic position can, at least sort of go, okay, well, maybe, I'm not, completely just, I don't have a complete embarrassment of riches here. There are some good arguments for the other side that lend to it being more probable than I assumed it was. I think that's, I think a fairly modest task, but I think it's accomplished, and I think that it's accomplished despite what some strong atheists might say about the likelihood of theism being a correct hypothesis.
Could we have people who haven't talked yet come in?
I
Chris?
don't have anything right now.
Nothing to say? Cheryl?
Well, my thought on that regard was that, with that example in there, was along similar lines to what he said, that there's nothing wrong with, being in awe of the universe and how complex it is in design. I don't use design in the creative sense, but, the apparent design. There's nothing wrong with being in awe of it. But I think where a lot of it comes down to is that people who adopt a theistic belief have to have a reason or an explanation, whereas people who reject that, they aren't saying that it's impossible that it's God, but they're comfortable with saying, I don't know, and leaving it at that, saying what came before all of those questions. We can be agnostic. It's okay to admit our ignorance and just be comfortable with the questions and not have to come up with an answer.
And that even if you decided that, even if you would decide that the beginning of the universe wasn't God's doing, that doesn't disprove the existence of God. Who says that God had to create the universe? Couldn't the universe, maybe God came into existence after the universe started?
Well, he wouldn't be God in any meaningful.
Well, according to your definition of God, but what if it was not that type of God? Maybe God is of a different nature than the Bible says.
It would definitely disprove a traditional monotheistic. I mean, I think that's the one thing that separates monotheism from just about any other view, is that there's that intelligence is prior to material, whereas whether it's an atheistic or a polytheistic viewpoint, they almost always will assert that matter exists prior to mind. So I think that, ultimately, at that point, I don't think that we're dealing with a substantial difference than just atheism. But